this computer. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. My name is Vira Salzburn, and I am the Program Director for Safety and Resiliency Programs at Chatham County Safety Net Planning Council. We are a nonprofit organization here in Savannah, Georgia, and we provide many different programs to help our community address adverse childhood experiences, trauma. We work in suicide prevention, promoting mental health, and various resiliency building programs and activities. And joining me today is Lieutenant Emory Randolph, who can maybe spend a little bit more time talking about what he does and where he works. And we are here together to talk about suicide prevention. So let's go ahead, Lieutenant Randolph, if you would like to just introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Emory, and I'm the Public Information Officer for the Tybee Island Police Department. In addition to that, I'm also a trained crisis intervention officer and our only hostage negotiator on staff.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
And we're here to talk about the subject that's not easy, and it can be quite difficult to even hear the word suicide. So really invite you all who is watching this webinar to take care of yourself emotionally while you're listening to us. And maybe if anything comes up, or you may notice some difficulties or extreme discomfort or unpleasant thoughts, please allow yourself to just pause this video. You have power to do that, and maybe take a break. And just because we recognize that a lot of people in our community on the Tybee Island may have been impacted by suicide, especially recently, and Lieutenant Randolph will talk about it. So we just want you to take care of yourself emotionally, physically, mentally, even during this presentation. So yes, we are here today to really talk about what's going on in our community. And maybe we can start with you, Emory, just describing what you've seen on Tybee Island.
Sure. So we actually deal with this quite a bit. We have several folks that come down every year with the intention to commit suicide at Tybee Island. And I've heard different theories about why. Some people say that being at the beach is both peaceful and serene and makes them feel like they're a little bit closer to a higher power. A lot of these folks we are able to intervene with and successfully get them help. Unfortunately, this year in particular, we have had a couple of high profile suicides that were completed. And that's one of the reasons that we're here today.
Thank you. And how about suicides among the residents? Specifically, I'm curious about young people, youth, young adults.
So we did have one in particular this year that impacted our community pretty hard. And over the past couple of years, we've seen a couple of teenagers make that decision to take their own life and have followed through and completed suicide. And again, that's one of the reasons that we wanted to talk today with you, Vera, so we can make sure that everybody has the information and the resources that they need to get help.
Yes, thank you. And as we all can imagine, it's been a hard couple of years for a lot of people, and especially younger people, young adults, kids in school. So yes, as a community, and it does take the entire community, we want to make sure that we open this conversation and that it doesn't stop there. What I've learned through my work, and I've been working in suicide prevention for the past 5 years, that it's not just one thing that leads a person to that decision. It's many different things in that person's life that start to get shaky, and therefore it takes a village. As we say, it takes a village to raise a child. I often say it takes a village to save a child from suicide. And also, each of us is that child, and all of us are that village. So when talking about suicide prevention in terms of young people, actually in the state of Georgia, suicide is the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 24.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's really high. And nationally, suicide is in general the 10th leading cause of death for various ages. What's interesting, and maybe you know this, Emory, so the first leading cause of death is heart disease, and the second one is cancer, and the third leading cause of death is unintended injuries or accidents. And maybe you can speak to that, because sometimes maybe not all suicides may be reported or recorded as suicides, especially if maybe there is not a suicide note left behind, or maybe there's not clear evidence if the person died by suicide or by some other accident. What do you know from that?
You know, we have experienced that here on Tybee. There was actually an incident earlier this year that we requested the Georgia Bureau of Investigation help us investigate because we weren't sure if it involved foul play or not at first, and that did turn out to be a suicide. So you're right. If they don't leave a note, it's not always 100% clear, and it does require a little bit of investigation on our part.
Yes, and when that investigation maybe is not clear, a lot of times, from what I understand, that death may not go to that category of suicide, but may go into that category of accidents.
Correct, yes.
Which, as we mentioned, is the third leading cause of death in the United States. Right. So really just based on some of the evidence that we've seen and working with behavioral health providers and law enforcement, I think it would be safe to assume that suicides may be closer to the top than we think, just because of how sometimes uncertain it is.
Absolutely.
Yes. And so with that said, we just wanted to kind of help explain in terms of statistics how common, unfortunately, this is. And if we don't talk about it openly in our community, is it going to go away? Probably not. And part of the reason we're here today to destigmatize the conversation and help ourselves get comfortable being uncomfortable, and really talking about this, what I say, S word. Sometimes even the word suicide is so uncomfortable to say, right?
Oh, absolutely. And as you know, a lot of people have the false impression that if they mention the word suicide, that actually plants the idea in somebody's head and they may follow through with it. That's just not true.
Yes, I appreciate you mentioning that. It is quite a common myth, especially when dealing with young adults and kids, that if we ask a child, are you thinking about suicide, that by doing so, we're going to make them think about it. Actually, I was reading this article that helped me recognize how that is not true. It described, for instance, for me, something precious in my life is my dog. And if someone were to ask me, hey, are you thinking about giving away your dog? And I'm not thinking about it. So them just by asking me that question, it's not going to force me to start think about, oh, maybe I should give my dog away. I don't need it anymore, right?
Sure.
But in fact, if I were thinking about giving away my dog and somebody asked me, that would maybe open that conversation. So it's kind of a metaphor to how our life is precious to us. And most people, if you ask them directly that question, and also compassionately and kindly and non-judgmentally, if they're not thinking about it, then that's okay. You just show that you really care by asking. But if they are, that's a big deal. Because then we we need to know so we can help that person.
I
Um,
agree, and just asking can definitely open the door for that conversation, and that's one of the most important steps.
yes, and Emory, I know you've done some training specifically in suicide intervention, and I'm actually applied suicide intervention master trainer. So I've trained a lot of people as well. And you also provide training, right, to law enforcement in crisis intervention. Is that right?
So I'm not a certified trainer in crisis intervention myself, but we do make sure that the majority of our staff are trained in that discipline, so we are able to help people if need be.
Yes. And when we look at all of this different training, crisis intervention, suicide intervention, mental health intervention, a lot of times asking a person directly that question is the key, right?
Right, absolutely.
And I just want you maybe to speak to the fact why this is important, asking that question directly.
You know, when in my experience, when somebody's thinking about killing themselves and committing suicide, uh, to them, that is the ultimate answer to ending their pain. So if you ask them a question like, are you thinking about hurting yourself? The answer is going to be no, because in their mind, committing suicide is stopping the pain, it's not causing it. And that's why it's important to ask directly, are you thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about committing suicide? And that, in my experience, is going to be more likely to draw out a true answer.
Yes. Thank you. And also asking if you notice something about someone as soon as possible, not waiting until the next day because the next day may be too late. Another way to think of it, when you ask someone, are you thinking about taking your own life? Are you thinking about suicide? It's almost like you put that mirror in front of their mind. In psychology, we use this concept of name it to tame it. You really need to name the problem to start working with it, addressing it. And if we're going to just tiptoe around the problem, we may call it depression, we may call it anxiety, we may call it isolation, but that's not truly it. And if we don't address it directly, then we may really lose an important opportunity. And ultimately, it is about saving a person's life, right?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Uh, so before we ask someone if or not if they're thinking about suicide, it is important maybe for us to discuss what are some risk factors perhaps that may be contributing to the person thinking about suicide. Um, so, for instance, it could be certain groups of individuals may be at higher risk for suicide. Emory, do you want to speak to some groups maybe that you've seen are likely to be at higher risk? Which in your community, maybe some tourists, also young people. Who else do you think might be at that higher risk?
You know, definitely people that have experienced things like traumatic loss, divorce, serious financial trouble, or just a few of the things that we've seen. We're a very diverse community, so when you start breaking it down as far as age and gender, that's a big mix for us. But we have noticed some of those big life-changing events have come into play.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, loss, I think of loss usually in many different ways. It could be a loss of a job, right? Or a loss of
Right.
a house, a loss of relationships, a loss of a dream, not being able to get into college or to be with a partner you wanted to be. So anytime when someone loses something that's important to them, that could be a contributing factor. Also, in terms of groups, perhaps people who identify as LGBTQ, right? That is one of the high risk groups. Also, if we look at individuals who maybe see a lot of trauma and see a lot of pain, including law enforcement, firefighters, gosh, thinking about first responders, during this pandemic, how traumatic that's been, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And also thinking about teachers in schools and how much stress they've endured. Um, and actually, if we start really going down the list, we can quickly arrive to the conclusion that almost anyone can be at risk of suicide.
I agree with that 100%. And a lot of times, what we've noticed is sometimes it's the people who make comments like, if you find me dead, then it was definitely murder. I would never commit suicide. Sometimes those people are the most at risk.
Mm, yes. So this is a good kind of segue. We can talk about some things that people maybe may say or do, or maybe based on their mood, how we can start noticing if maybe those people are at risk for suicide. So, what are some other things people may say in your experience that may suggest they have thoughts of suicide?
You know, as far as things that they say, I'm drawing a blank off the top of my head, but I can tell you some of the actions that we've come across are if they're suddenly in a better mood, if they've been in a depressed state for sometimes days, weeks, months, and all of a sudden they come into work one day and they're very happy, that could be an indication that they're preparing to kill themselves. Giving away belongings, especially very personal items like a beloved pet, and making arrangements for them to be cared for are things that you should definitely be on the lookout for as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, giving away possessions, mood changes, sudden improvement. Also, a lot of times, maybe seeing if people are withdrawing from activities that they've usually been doing, isolation. My colleague works at a crisis helpline, and she says one of the most common things people say when they call is I'm so tired of everything. I'm just so tired. So that even that in itself, when someone says something like that, when there is maybe a profound hopelessness or just lack of motivation to move forward, that in itself may be a reason to ask and be curious. What's going on? Are you thinking about suicide? I had a friend who lost her house to fire, and that's all I knew at the time. And then she moved away. She lived in Savannah, and she moved away to another town. And then she called me. It was maybe a couple months after that, and we were talking about life in general. And she mentioned having some other relationship problems, which also can be a contributing factor. And I necessarily didn't see her day-to-day behavior. Maybe I didn't see her depression or her isolation, but I just knew the fact that she experienced some profound loss and also was experiencing stresses in other areas of life. So this is how I asked my friend. I said, I hear you saying that you've been through a lot lately, and these are the things you are dealing with. And then I connected kind of to the bigger picture, so she doesn't feel like I'm pointing finger at her. So I say, a lot of times when people experience these losses or these types of stresses, a lot of times those people start having thoughts of suicide or thinking about suicide. Is that something you are thinking about? Are you thinking about suicide? So this is kind of I have kind of a way to ask that question without a person feeling attacked or, without them feeling like something is wrong with them, but just really helping them recognize that it's a big deal what you're dealing with. And a lot of times people may start having thoughts of suicide during those types of life events. And then you can move into that direct question. Yeah.
I think that was a great way to go about it. I appreciate you sharing that story. I might use that in the future myself.
Yes, absolutely. So, and here's an invitation to everybody watching this. You know, you are a noticer in your community, in your family, and you know better than others if your loved one or someone you see on a daily basis, if they start acting in a way that's unusual. if suddenly they have changes in behavior or appearance. And even I encourage people, even if it's something small, but if you have that inner voice, that intuition, that gut feeling, something is off, go ahead and have the conversation. In fact, our bodies, our brains are able to communicate proverbally. We have in our part of the brain the structures called mirror neurons. They can literally mirror the pain of others. That's why caregivers a lot of times get caregiver fatigue, or even secondary trauma may be a part of that. So sometimes we may see someone and it may not be clear exactly what's going on, but our brain is telling us something is off. And a lot of times, and I said, the gut feeling, well, the brain and the gut are really connected. So again, we can tap into our intuition and just listen to that inner voice. And I encourage you, if anytime you notice or you just feel like something is off, something is not okay, don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. So all right, so this is kind of, we're talking about the process, maybe noticing something about the person, maybe recognizing if they're going through something difficult, asking that question if they're having thoughts of suicide. Another important step, especially when we are trying to have that conversation with an individual, to have that intervention, is to really take time and listen to the person. A lot of times, out of the goodness of our heart, and also because we want things to get better faster, we try to fix things and not take the time to listen to the person. So we would rather say, don't say that, why are you talking about that? Or here's the phone number, call them, maybe they'll help you. But wouldn't you say, Emory, that a lot of times people just need that listening ear?
When we start selecting officers to go to crisis intervention or hostage negotiations, sometimes you come across men and women who say, well, I'm not that good at talking to people. And we tell them it's a lot more about listening and a lot less about talking. It's not so much what you say, but just the fact that you're willing to listen to what's going on in their life and they have somebody to vent that to.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And, and I do this type of training for kids too, actually middle schoolers, high schoolers. And a lot of times, I'll ask kids, what are some of the attributes of a good listener, right? That eye contact, body language, right? So we present ourselves as open to this, as we are there in a compassionate presence with the person. Also, just don't be on your phone.
That's hard for people these days, right?
Yeah, exactly. So maybe if you have that serious conversation, just give the person your full attention. Right. And attention is precious. Where you put attention to, there it grows. So it's a gift. So give people the gift of attention and compassion, and also non-judgment, right?
Absolutely. And that's one thing that I was going to mention, Vera. I apologize for interrupting you, but the non-judgmental aspect is very important. You may not always understand exactly what somebody's going through, but you can understand that they're upset about it. And that's exactly what I would say. Instead of telling somebody, I understand, you can just say, I understand that you're upset, or I sense that you're upset, and go from there.
Thank you. Yes, this is a really good note. And what I a lot of times use in my language, I just say, I see it's very hard for you.
Absolutely.
Or, any language, kind of going back to that, naming it, to tame it. Any language that helps the person see that I see your suffering. I see that that's a lot, and you're going through a lot. And what's also interesting when talking about judgment, not passing judgment, what I've noticed through my work, that a lot of times people who are struggling with thoughts of suicide, they're also struggling with judging themselves for having those thoughts. It's like that additional layer of stress they're adding on. Their heart is already in pain. They're already in having this experience of difficult emotions. And then there's this layer of shame and guilt and judgment they're passing on themselves. So our role as a helper is to really help alleviate that judgment and help them connect to this idea of common humanity, that as human beings, a lot of us have been actually having those thoughts. A lot of people had thoughts of suicide, or at least thoughts of, I don't want to be here anymore, or this is too much. And also that a lot of people go through difficult situations in life, not to diminish what maybe a particular person is going through when we're talking to them, but just help them recognize that, if you're going through relationship problems, that there's no room. Shame may be there, but how can we reduce that shame? Because there's so many other people who are going through something difficult. Or if you have financial problems, and if you have any sort of other difficulties, health problems, to help people see that they're not alone. Ultimately, they're not alone, and that other people also experience pain, and that life is imperfect.
I definitely agree with that. Again, going back to that non-judgmental aspect, like you said, they're already beating themselves up enough. So you definitely, as shocking as some things may be, when they start unloading their problems on you, you definitely want to maintain that very neutral atmosphere, and just let them know that you're there to listen and that you want to help them any way you can.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Emory. All right,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
we talked about kind of the warning signs, risk factors, asking the question directly, listening, and let's move on now. Let's say after we take the time to really give the person space and attention that they need to talk about their problems, it is still important as a part of the intervention to create a safe plan and keep the person safe. Kind of want to give the disclosure here. We're not trying to solve all of their problems or create a year-long plan. Today, we're just talking about how to keep a person safe for now, how to provide them the immediate supports, and later on, as a part of that plan, could be linking them to some more long-term care. So what are some steps, Emory, that may be usually a part of the protocol if a person says they're thinking about suicide? What are some ways that you can help keep them safe?
So speaking from the police department aspect, we always reinforce to them that we do have crisis intervention officers on staff if they need someone to talk to. We also remind them that they may have a family member or friend that they can reach out to, and we try to connect them with that person and establish that bridge as somebody that they can speak to in times of crisis.
Yes, that's beautiful. A lot of times we want to, first of all, make sure we're not the only helper. I cannot emphasize it enough. The helper should never be the only helper.
Right.
And connecting them to those professional and personal contacts. It could be a doctor, it could be a counselor, it could be a law enforcement member, but it could be also a brother, sister, parent, and whoever that other personal contact may be. And one of good practices is to actually write down with that person the list of those individuals and their phone numbers, and maybe even make a call together with that person, and offering them, would it be okay if we make a call together to this individual we have on our list as your supporter, as your helper, so we can just kind of loop them into the situation and let them know what's going on. Another important part of the Keep Safe plan is to identify what was the plan for that person, if they had a plan, if they said yes, they were thinking about suicide. What were they going to do? How were they going to do it? Right. So what means were they thinking about using? What's the location they were thinking about doing it? And of course, with that knowledge, we can start taking steps to maybe remove the means. Maybe if they were going to use a firearm, making sure they don't have access to it until they are more stabilized. I will say I'm also trained in the specific training around access to lethal means. And unfortunately, in the communities where people have more access to firearms, there are also high rates of suicide. And, when we have teenagers in the house, even if they are, let's say, not showing any signs of mental health problems or suicidal ideations, I would still encourage parents to make sure that they don't know or don't have access to the firearms. A lot of times, and you may know better about this, what are some strategies that can help people to kind of reduce access to lethal means?
So, whether you're talking about suicide or firearm safety in general, we definitely advocate to have some sort of safe system set up, like a weapon safe or a gun lock, especially to keep children away from the weapon or teenagers.
Yes, thank you. And if you maybe have a lot of medication in your household, maybe making sure that, again, young people don't have access to that, locking that cabinet or having some kind of lock box or something like that, just because, kids are vulnerable these days. And reducing those lethal means, removing those lethal means, it's a huge step in prevention. It's a huge step in prevention. Let's see. So another part of the keep safe step of this creating a safe plan step, a lot of times we talk to people and say, if you have any alcohol in your house or any drugs, just for right now, well, we're going through this process of stabilization and making sure you're okay. It's best if you don't have access to that alcohol or drugs, because a lot of times it can make things worse, which sometimes may be harder to control, especially with adults. But again, just making sure that people don't have access, or just not mentioning it to them, right? And that can make things worse. I'm an adult child of an alcoholic parent, and I know that it's a history in my family. I'm from Ukraine originally. So a lot of Ukrainians live in poverty, and a lot of trauma, and which that leads to people trying to cope with things the best they can with life. And alcohol is one of those things. So I know that, in different communities, people cope with things differently, and maybe recognizing that a lot of times we use alcohol and drugs to self-soothe ourselves, when ultimately deep down, maybe we have needs that need to be addressed, need to be seen, need to be comforted, need to protect ourselves, need to separate ourselves from the real world full of problems. So that's kind of where, we can go deeper and talk about other things and addictions, which we don't have to, but just kind of recognizing that people are trying to cope with life, and life is hard. Again, not passing judgment, but being more understanding and helping people connect with the resources that they need.
Absolutely. Things like alcohol and drugs definitely lower inhibitions. And I've heard a lot of stories from people who had suicidal ideations that told me that they would need to get intoxicated in order to get to a place where they felt like they would be capable of committing suicide or completing suicide. Mm-hmm. And so, like you said, taking that out of the equation is definitely a big step.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, maybe we can talk a little bit about specific resources that that people can use to connect someone or themselves if they're facing suicidal thoughts. So Emory, what are some things that Tybee Island has?
So again, a vast majority of our staff are trained in crisis intervention. And if you were to contact the police department and let us know that you or a loved one were having suicidal ideations, we would try to get one of those men or women out to you to speak with you. And sometimes that's all it takes is an officer listening to the issues that are in your life at the time and then helping you work through a safe plan. Other times we will connect you with emergency medical personnel and encourage you to seek voluntary treatment. And then there's also, push come to shove, if a crime has been committed in the meantime, there's what's called a 1013, which is an involuntary committal to the hospital that law enforcement can help facilitate.
Yes, thank you. I would like to also mention that in Savannah, we have a Gateway Behavioral Health Crisis Center. It's located on 2121 East Duran Avenue. It's right across from the Food Line. It's fairly new facility, about 2 years old, and you can think of it as an emergency room for mental health. So a lot of times you can take yourself or your loved one to Gateway's Crisis Center, and they will receive assessment. They have also they can also support people, and people can stay there for a few days if they need to be stabilized. And so that's a really good resource that we have in our community. And it is also for individuals who may not have insurance or be underinsured, because that is also a huge gap in services. People a lot of times don't reach out for help because they may not have financial resources or health insurance. Gateway's Savannah Counseling, which is also part of Gateway, is another resource where they take even walk-ins or people without insurance as well. So I wanted to mention that. Also, for young people, there is a crisis text number. It's 741-741 crisis text line. And a lot of kids and teenagers like to text, and they would rather reach out to someone for help via text than calling. So that's a good resource that a lot of times we would share with youth. And anytime you text, you will have a professional trained counselor who will text you back and can guide you through the process. You can also text actually as a helper. You may not be the person at risk, but you may want to know what to do. Suicide Prevention Lifeline is another resource. I'm going to look the number real quick. I don't remember from the top of my head. Let's see, it's 800-273-8255. Or you can just look up Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Actually, good news. There is policy in place nationally. This law number for the Lifeline is going to change in June or July next year to the number 988. So we have 911 for emergencies, and this will be 988 for mental health emergencies or crisis.
Yeah, I heard that. I think that's a great thing.
Yes. Let's see. Well, also just remember that if you or your loved ones are struggling, a big part of it is just not to leave them alone in that struggle. And if you're alone at your house and you are suddenly overwhelmed with thoughts of suicide or hopelessness, A lot of times I tell people, just get in your car and just drive yourself to the nearest emergency room, or even to your family or friend's house, or to a walk-in clinic, just any place where you're not alone, and also where you can talk about it. If you're at Tybee Island, you can, I'm sure, go to the maybe police office, right?
Absolutely.
And you're not going to be arrested because you have thoughts of suicide. Um,
And that's a big misconception, Vera, that people think that, if the police come to your house or you come to the police department with an issue, that somebody's automatically going to get in trouble or go to jail. And that's not the case. Again, we are a very big proponent of the crisis intervention system, and we're definitely here to help people, not to punish.
yes, thank you. Well, thank you, Emory, for all you do, and for the work you do in your community. Hopefully, we will continue having these conversations, bringing suicide awareness to Tybee Island, to the schools where the kids go from Tybee. We also would like to maybe organize training for the community. So we invite everyone to stay tuned. This webinar is going to be posted on Facebook. So maybe you are watching it from Facebook right now. And please reach out to, please feel free to reach out to me. I will include my email in the Facebook post. And also, please reach out to your officers at Tybee, to your first responders. Don't feel like you're alone in whatever you're dealing with, because you're not. And there's so many caring, compassionate people who really want you to live, who really want you to stay alive. And so thank you so much for this time, Emory. And I hope you have good holidays, good Thanksgiving, Christmas.
Oh, you too. Thank you so much. I look forward to helping more people with you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.